Hello and welcome back to GotAnswers, my series here on my channel Skepticism, where we go through all of the Christian apologist bullshit that we find on GotQuestions.org. The question that we're diving into today is, what should we learn from the golden calf incident in Exodus 32? Here's their answer. The story of the golden calf is found in Exodus 32, verses 1 through 6. The children of Israel had been in bondage in Egypt for over 200 years. God called Moses, the deliverer, makes him sound like a pizza delivery guy, and told him that he had heard their cries and was about to deliver them. During their time in Egypt, the Israelites had apparently begun to doubt the existence of the God their fathers worshipped. To help Moses prove the existence and power of God, he was given a number of miraculous signs to help the Israelites believe. After all of these miracles were done, including the 10 plagues on the Egyptians, the Israelites came out of Egypt with a renewed belief in the God of their fathers. They passed through the Red Sea on dry land while the Egyptian army was drowned, and they were brought to the mountain of God to receive his laws. So a quick note here before we get into more of this. It says, the Israelites had apparently begun to doubt the existence of the God of their fathers, the God their fathers had worshipped. That's not what it says. This is just another example where they are pulling verses in some twisted means of trying to make their own apologetic case. But Exodus 3, verse 13 says, Then Moses said to God, If I come to the people of Israel and say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, What is his name? What shall I say to them? This is Moses asking for a way to verify to the Israelites that he had actually spoken to God. Moses wasn't even with the Israelites. He had followed his own path. He was raised in the house of the Pharaoh, so it's not like he was one of them truly. So of course, if he comes to them and says, Hey, I talked to God and I'm going to lead you out, of course they're going to be doubtful. This has nothing to do with whether or not the Israelites in their Egyptian bondage had begun to doubt the existence of the God their fathers worshiped. This is just another sad misreading of plain text that we get from the apologists on GotQuestions.org all the time. But moving on with their answer. The people of the Middle East were very religious, but they also worshipped many gods. The 10 plagues God brought on the Egyptians were judgments against specific gods they worshipped and showed that the Lord was greater than all of them. Even Moses' father-in-law Jethro, who was the priest of Midian and a worshiper of the true God, was impacted by the religious pluralism of the people around him. When Moses and the people arrived at Mount Sinai, and Jethro heard of all God's works, he replied, Now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods, because in this affair they dealt arrogantly with the people. When God gave his laws to the Israelites, he began by addressing this religious pluralism. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me. In case it seems like all I ever do is trash GotQuestions.org, I will say that in this paragraph, or these first couple paragraphs, I'm a little surprised at their honesty in this, in acknowledging the religious pluralism of the day, because there are a lot of apologists who don't like to acknowledge that the Israelites were polytheists and have quite a strong heritage of polytheism until much later in biblical history. And apologists normally don't like to admit that, because if they admit that, here's where it gets sticky. Yahweh was one of the gods of the pantheon of the polytheists. Now, granted, their answer here is not actually saying that, but usually apologists don't even like to go into this aspect of it because it opens the door to understanding all kinds of facts that don't make Yahweh, who is the Christian God, sound very monotheistic. I'm also surprised that they kept the second commandment pretty well intact. A lot of times I hear this commandment quoted and all they talk about is having no other gods before me. And then they just kind of leave it alone. Usually they don't go into all the detail of the Lord saying, I am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me. I think it kind of speaks to the tone deafness of apologists that they would put this in there without thinking that this really makes their God sound like crap. But kudos on them for not butchering that. Back to their answer. While Moses was up on the mountain receiving God's laws, the people were getting anxious down on the plain. Moses spent 40 days up on the mountain with God, and by the end of that time, the people were beginning to think Moses had died or left them. The people urged Aaron, their temporary leader, to make gods for them to follow. Since they were accustomed to having visual representations of gods, this was the natural but sinful result of their thinking. Aaron took their gold earrings, which they had brought from Egypt. Spoiler alert, they looted from Egypt, but that's another story. Had brought from Egypt and melted them down to make a golden idol. The idol he crafted for them was a calf, but Aaron maintained the name of the Lord in connection with it. He was merging the pagan practices they were familiar with and the worship of the God they were just beginning to be reacquainted with. Aaron called the people together and told them that the golden calf was the God who delivered them from Egypt. The people offered sacrifices and then engaged in pagan rituals, including orgies, to worship this new God. Okay. The honesty or frankness that they had in the first couple paragraphs is starting to melt away here. The bull that he created, or the calf, the bull could very well have been reminiscent of Yahwism itself. Remember, I said that the early Israelites were not monotheists, they were polytheists, and in the pantheon of gods that they worshipped was Yahweh. Newsflash, Yahweh is the name of the Christian God. And Yahweh was not the top God. He was one of the lesser gods, under El. So the idea that, I don't know where they would get this bull from, that's kind of BS, all right? If you go back and just Google Yahwism, one of the first images you'll come up is an image of a bull. The idea that Aaron did this and then just connected this to the name of God is a bit disingenuous, to say the least. And I was kind of surprised to see them reference orgies. That is an interpretation. Now, to be clear, the text reads that they were out of control. And as I did my God-free Bible study series or episode on this, I mentioned that that's a weird statement. What's exactly meant by out of control? If you want to interpret out of control as orgies, fine. I guess that would be one way of saying that they're out of control, but that's absolutely not what the text says. But what they really gloss over here, and this is the part I really wanted to talk about because it talks to how everything is always the fault of the people. There's never a fault on God or God's chosen mouthpieces. The text is very clear that, yes, Moses went on top of the mountain for 40 days. Nowhere in the text does it say that God told Moses you'll be up here for 40 days, or that Moses communicated to the people that they'll be up here for 40 days. In other words, you have a very old man ascending to the top of a mountain, which, according to other pieces of the text, made it sound like it's covered in storms and clouds and all this because it's Yahweh, and Yahweh is a storm god. Again, that's another topic. But he's up here for 40 days, and then they're shocked to find that when he comes down from the mountain, that he's shocked and God is shocked to find that they are worshiping pagan idols, which are really kind of idols designed to look like their ideas of Yahweh anyway. Why wouldn't they revert back? Because you literally gave them no direction whatsoever. You just said, hey, bro, I'm going to the mountain for a minute. And you didn't come back for 40 days. And I know you can tell me, well, we just had the 10 Commandments and he just said, don't do the idol thing. So I'm not trying to, even in the context of the Bible, I am not trying to excuse this behavior, but I'm also saying that this happens frequently in the text where there is something happening that it's very easy to understand why the people in general would have had this feeling, this emotion, or would have done these actions, and yet the response that we get from God is one of angry retribution. And it's really very irresponsible, childish, and gross. Going on to the answer, it says, why did Aaron do this? Scripture doesn't give us the full answer, but we can put certain clues together and get a fairly good picture. First, the people's long familiarity with idol worship would incline them to follow that method in the absence of clear direction otherwise. Second, they were already in the habit of merging their beliefs with those of the people around them, a practice that would continue to plague them throughout the kingdom years. Third, Aaron was faced with an unruly crowd that placed a demand on him. The solution of making an idol and calling it by God's name seemed fairly reasonable. Why did he choose a calf or bull? His lame excuse to Moses. It just came out of the fire like this. In my Bible study video, I did say that was hilarious. That was just a feeble attempt to dodge blame. He fashioned it with a graving tool, and he took great care to form it that way. Some have tried to show that the bull represented one of the gods of Egypt. No. Who tries to show that? But that doesn't fit the text, because Aaron called a feast to the Lord, Yahweh, and said that it was the god or gods which brought them out of the land of Egypt. The bull was a symbol of strength and fertility, and the people were already familiar with bull gods from Egypt. No, the people were already familiar with bull gods from Yahwism. Bulls were also typical animals of sacrifice, so to use their image as a symbol of the god being worshipped was a natural connection. Aaron's bull was a mixture of the powerful God who delivered the people through mighty works and the pagan methods of worship that were borrowed from the people around them. So there's a con going on here where they don't really want to tell you about the history of Yahwism itself. This shifts the blame to the people rather than to God. Yahweh came, again, from a pantheon of gods, one where he, in the context of these stories, is trying to assert himself as the top god. At least he's trying now to assert himself as the top god. El, which is part of where the name Israel comes from, was the top god in the pantheon. But this, much of the Old Testament is really the story of a lesser god essentially rising through the ranks and saying, no, at least with regards to the Hebrew, I'm the top god now. That's what this is about. But you don't want to get this from a site that talks about Christian apologetics. So, of course, they want to tell us that these people are reverting to this kind of worship, when what they're really doing is they're just embracing a type of worship which they had all along. And yes, they did just get this commandment that no more idols, but also then you pull the big prophet Moses up on a mountain for 40 days, a man who was, I think at this point, 85 or 90 years old, and gave them no clue about when he was coming back. So what they did here was hardly some horrible, unspeakable crime. And that's what gets completely glossed over in this story. Back to GotQuestions answer. Even though there are reasonable explanations for why Aaron and the people began to worship the golden calf, those explanations do not excuse the sin. God certainly held the people accountable for their corruption and was ready to destroy them for their sin. Moses' personal intercession on behalf of his people saved them. Moses indicated that Aaron at least should have known that his actions were sinful and didn't let him off the hook. As with any other sin, the punishment is death, and the only proper response is repentance. Moses called for those who were on the Lord's side to come stand with him. The Levites stood with him and were commanded to go through the camp and kill anyone who persisted in the idolatry. 3,000 men were killed that day. The next day Moses went up and confessed the people's sins before God, asking for his forgiveness. God declared that the guilty ones would yet pay with their own deaths and be blotted out of his book. These were the same ones who, on the verge of entering the promised land, would deny God's promises and be sent into the wilderness to die for their sins. Their children would be the ones to receive God's promised blessings. Their experiences are a lesson to us today. Even though we might justify our actions through reason or logic, if we are violating God's clear commands, we are sinning against him, and he will hold us accountable for those sins. God is not to be worshipped with images, because any image we make will draw more attention to the work of our hands than the God who made all things. Also, there is no way we can ever fully represent the holiness and awesomeness of God through an image. The attempt to do so will always fall short. On top of this, God is a spirit, and we cannot form an image of a spirit. We worship God by believing his word, obeying it, and declaring his greatness to others. They proceed to tell this whole story as though it's perfectly understandable and logical. And these last two paragraphs of theirs really take the cake. I love how they just kind of breeze through the fact that after this horrible sin had been done by the people, God forbid they actually worship when they don't know what else to do. Moses calls on the Levites to go on a slaughter fest, and that they do. They kill thousands of people. Also, there is a misstatement in here that I find really gross, because it says that Moses called for them to basically punish anyone who is still doing this. But that's not what the text said. Moses just basically called the Levites and said, go out and start killing people. And that's what they did. And also notice how it acknowledges here that Aaron was absolutely complicit in this. And it tells us the punishment for sin is death. But you know who didn't get murdered as a consequence of this? Aaron didn't. Aaron survived. No one went to go kill Aaron, because I guess if you're the brother of the prophet, then you don't have to actually pay with death. But if you're one of these other poor saps, yes, you do. And then I don't even understand, even in a biblical sense, this logic, because Moses goes through and tells the Levites to start slaughtering people, and they do. And that wasn't enough for God, so then he put a plague on them. Like, really, what's the point of having your murder team go through and start wiping people out, and then, oh yeah, now I'm going to give you a plague too? That's just a dick move right there. That's just a real dick move. The whole story, but especially the way that this is dealt with at the end, is so gross. And we're supposed to take this as this. I mean, I remember seeing the golden calf in storybooks. But the fact that they use this as an excuse to go through and just start slaughtering people, and we're supposed to hold this up as a wonderful story, this is what really puts the cherry on the cake of making it really gross. I also want to bring up one last point, because this comes up again and again in there, the GotQuestions answers. This is on top of this, God is a spirit, and we cannot form an image of a spirit. Well, we are made in God's image. Are we spirits? That just makes no damn sense. Once again, it is the claptrap that we get from GotQuestions.org. Thank you again for joining us on GotAnswers. Please like, please subscribe, Please leave all your hateful comments down below. Start all the flame wars. I don't care. But thank you for joining us, and I hope to see you again on another episode of Got Answers on my channel, Skepticus.